I'll never forget the first time he drank his coffee alone. Not because it was a lonely ritual, but because at that moment it was the closest thing to a silent scream the mansion ever heard, and no one seemed to hear it. I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you're cleaning a kitchen, folding clothes, or heading home after a long day. It doesn't matter what time it is, but I promise, today's story will surprise you. The fog rolled thick over San Francisco Bay that October morning, wrapping the city in its familiar gray embrace. In the financial district, stock tickers flickered with numbers that meant billions of dollars, fortunes rising and falling with each digital heartbeat. But high above the city's pulse, in a mansion perched on Russian Hill where the fog couldn't quite reach, lived a man whose wealth seemed as endless as his emptiness. Howard Bennett had built his empire on technology investments that turned into gold mines. His portfolio sparkled with blue-chip stocks, cryptocurrency holdings that included enough Bitcoin to fund small nations, and real estate assets stretching from Silicon Valley to Manhattan. The financial magazines called him the Oracle of the West Coast, a man whose investment decisions moved markets. But none of those publications mentioned the sound that echoed through his marble halls each morning at exactly 7:15, the lonely clink of a sterling silver spoon against bone china, stirring sugar into coffee that tasted like ash. The Bennett estate sprawled across 3 acres of prime San Francisco real estate, its value climbing past $20 million without effort. Every room whispered of wealth: Persian rugs that cost more than most people's houses, crystal chandeliers that caught the morning light like frozen tears, and windows that framed the bay like expensive paintings. But wealth, Howard had learned, was a peculiar thing. It could buy silence, but not peace. It could purchase isolation, but not healing. 3 years had passed since Catherine's funeral. 3 years since the cancer took the only person who could make him laugh. The grief had settled into his bones like winter fog, cold and persistent. His children, David, 28 and bitter, Sarah, 25 and distant, visited only when their trust fund payments required signatures. They moved through the mansion like strangers, their eyes holding the same hollow look that stared back at Howard from his bathroom mirror each morning. The household staff worked with mechanical precision, their uniforms pressed, their movements silent. They understood their place in the ecosystem of wealth, invisible unless needed, efficient without emotion. The cook, Mrs. Henderson, prepared meals that went mostly untouched. The gardener, Miguel, maintained grounds that no one walked. The housekeepers came and went in shifts, their faces blending into one anonymous blur of service. But on this particular Tuesday morning, as autumn painted the city in shades of gold and rust, everything would change. Not because of market fluctuations or investment opportunities, but because a woman named Maria Santos was about to step off a Muni bus at the bottom of Russian Hill, her worn leather purse clutched tightly in hands that had known more work than the mansion's fortune could measure. Maria's journey to the Bennett estate began before dawn, in a studio apartment in the Mission District where the rent consumed half her modest income. She had risen at 4:30, as she had every day for the past 15 years, to prepare for another day of invisible labor. The morning routine was wholly in its simplicity. Instant coffee from a chipped mug, a slice of toast that served as both breakfast and hope, and a glance at the framed photograph of her mother, Elena, whose medical bills had shaped Maria's every financial decision for the past decade. The commute stretched across the city like a daily pilgrimage. First, the 24 bus through neighborhoods where Spanish mingled with English on corner stores and laundromats. Then, a transfer downtown where glass towers reflected dreams and disappointments in equal measure. And finally, the climb up Russian Hill where the houses grew larger and the people grew fewer. 2 hours each way, 4 hours of her life, spent in transit between 2 worlds that rarely acknowledged each other's existence. At 53, Maria carried her years with dignity. Her black hair, streaked with silver she couldn't afford to hide, was always pulled back in a neat bun. Her uniforms, 3 identical navy dresses she had sewn herself, were clean and pressed, maintained with the same care she brought to everything she touched. But it was her eyes that told the real story, dark brown depths that held kindness. Like water holds light, reflecting a strength that poverty could not break and wealth could not buy. The employment agency had been blunt about the position. The Bennett family doesn't keep help long, the coordinator had warned, shuffling papers with bureaucratic indifference. Mr. Bennett is particular. The last 3 housekeepers left within 6 months, but the pay is excellent, $1,200 a week, cash. If you can handle the isolation and the attitude, it could be lucrative. $1,200. The number had echoed in Maria's mind as she signed the papers. Enough to cover Elena's medications with money left over for groceries that included more than rice and beans. Enough to maybe someday think about dreams beyond survival. But as she walked up the cobblestone driveway of the Bennett estate, watching the fog drift around Gothic towers and manicured gardens, Maria understood that some prices went beyond currency. The mansion loomed before her like something from another century, It's Victorian architecture, speaking of old money and older secrets. Gargoyles perched on corners where modern security systems watched with electronic eyes. The gardens, precisely maintained, bloomed with flowers that would die before anyone stopped to smell them. Even the morning air seemed expensive here, thin and rarefied, lacking the warmth of bus exhaust and street vendor coffee that flavored her neighborhood's atmosphere. Mrs. Henderson answered the service entrance, her gray hair pulled into a severe bun that matched her expression. She looked Maria up and down with the practiced assessment of someone who had seen too many hopeful faces disappear into the mansion's demanding embrace. "You're the new girl," she said, not quite a question, not quite a welcome. "I'm Mrs. Henderson, head of household staff. Mr. Bennett doesn't like disruption, doesn't like noise, doesn't like complications. You keep to your duties. You might last longer than the others." The orientation was brief and brutal. Maria's domain would include the main floors, 8 bedrooms, 6 bathrooms, 3 sitting rooms, a library that smelled of leather and disappointment, and the kitchen where Mr. Bennett took his morning coffee in solitude. Her schedule stretched from 6 in the morning until whatever time the work was finished, which Mrs. Henderson implied was rarely before 9 at night. "The family doesn't socialize with staff," Mrs. Henderson continued, leading Maria through halls where their footsteps echoed despite thick carpeting. "Mr. Bennett, especially, he's particular about his privacy. The children come and go as they please. But you're not to engage them in conversation unless specifically asked. And whatever you do, don't touch anything in the master bedroom. It's been sealed since Mrs. Bennett passed." As they walked, Maria absorbing every instruction, every warning, every unspoken rule, she began to understand the true nature of her new workplace. The mansion wasn't a home, it was a mausoleum. The wealth displayed on every surface wasn't prosperity, it was a gilded cage. And somewhere within these walls, behind the armor of money and manners, lived people whose wounds were as real as her own. Her first glimpse of Howard Bennett came at exactly 7:15 that morning, as Mrs. Henderson had predicted. Maria was polishing the banister in the main hall when she heard footsteps on the marble stairs, measured, deliberate, carrying the weight of routine. She stepped back into the shadows, as instructed, and watched as a tall man in an expensive robe descended toward the kitchen. Even from a distance, she could see the burden he carried. His shoulders, which should have been squared with confidence, curved slightly inward, as if protecting something fragile. His hair, silver and perfectly styled, caught the morning light filtering through stained glass windows, creating a halo effect that only emphasized the darkness around his eyes. He moved like a man walking underwater, each step deliberate but somehow disconnected from purpose. The kitchen, when Maria finally saw it an hour later, told its own story. Granite countertops that could have fed a family for years gleamed unused. Copper pots hung in perfect rows, their surfaces reflecting nothing but emptiness. And there, in a small nook overlooking the garden, sat a single-place setting: bone, china cup, saucer, silver spoon, linen napkin, the altar where Howard Bennett performed his daily ritual of remembering how to be alone. The coffee cup, Maria noticed as she cleaned, still held warmth, but the warmth felt wrong somehow, artificial, like everything else in the mansion. It was the warmth of expensive machines and premium beans, but it lacked the fundamental ingredient that turned coffee into comfort, someone to share it with. As her first week dissolved into routine, Maria began to understand the complex ecosystem of grief that governed the Bennett household. David, the son, returned from his downtown law office each evening carrying resentment like a briefcase, his inherited wealth, a burden he wore with practiced bitterness. He spoke to staff in clipped sentences that held years of unprocessed anger, his words careful to wound without leaving visible scars. Sarah, the daughter, floated through this mansion like a ghost haunting her own life. Her trust fund supported an art career that produced beautiful paintings no one would ever see, canvases lined against her bedroom walls like windows into a soul that had learned too early that love was temporary but money was forever. She moved with a dancer's grace, but her movements held no joy, only the muscle memory of motions that once had meaning. The staff, Maria quickly learned, had adapted to the emotional climate by developing their own defense mechanisms. Mrs. Henderson ruled the kitchen with military precision, using routine as armor against the mansion's persistent sadness. Miguel, the gardener, spoke only in Spanish and only about plants, as if language itself could protect him from the weight of working in a place where beauty existed but happiness did not. Maria's presence disrupted nothing at first. She cleaned with the same methodical care she had brought to every job, understanding that in houses like this, invisibility was not just expected but required. She dusted picture frames that held memories she wasn't meant to see, vacuumed carpets that muffled conversations she wasn't meant to hear, and polished surfaces that reflected a world she wasn't meant to join. But Maria possessed something that couldn't be taught in training manuals or measured in efficiency reports. She noticed things. The way dust gathered thicker on certain tables, suggesting which rooms held active grief and which held only decorative sorrow. The way Mr. Bennet's coffee cup was always returned to the exact same spot, as if ritual could resurrect routine, and routine could resurrect hope. The way the mansion's silence wasn't empty, but full, heavy with words unsaid, songs unsung, laughter that had died with the woman whose portraits watched from gilt frames throughout the house. On her 10th day, as November rain drummed against windows that had been professionally cleaned but had forgotten how to sparkle, Maria made her first real contact with the mansion's wounds. She was cleaning the library when she heard it, a sound that didn't belong in the carefully orchestrated symphony of wealth and silence. It was crying, not the dramatic weeping that demanded attention, but the quiet, exhausted sobbing that came when grief had finally worn down pride. Following the sound, Maria found Sarah curled in a reading chair that faced the garden but saw nothing. The young woman's shoulders shook with the effort of containing sorrow that had grown too large for her small frame. Her fingers clutched a photograph. Her mother, Maria realized, in younger days when laughter lived in the spaces between words. Protocol demanded that Maria retreat, pretend she had seen nothing, protect the Bennett family's right to suffer in private. But something deeper than duty made her step forward, made her touch Sarah's shoulder with the same gentle firmness she had once used to comfort her own mother during the fearful nights when pain made sleep impossible. Sarah looked up, startled, ready to snap at the presumption. But when their eyes met, something passed between them that transcended the careful boundaries of employer and employee. Recognition, perhaps, the understanding that sorrow was sorrow, regardless of the thread count of the sheets it slept on. "She used to read to me here," Sarah whispered, her voice raw with the kind of honesty that only comes when grief strips away pretense. "Every night when I was little, even when she got sick, even when speaking hurt her. She said stories were the only things that lived forever." Maria nodded, not with the professional sympathy she might have offered a client, but with the deep understanding of someone who had also lost the person who made bedtime stories feel like magic. She didn't speak. Words would have been intrusion. Instead, she sat quietly nearby, close enough to offer comfort, far enough to allow dignity, and let her presence say what language could not. "You are not alone in this." The moment lasted perhaps 5 minutes, but it cracked something open in the mansion's careful architecture of isolation. When Sarah finally wiped her eyes and whispered, "Thank you," the words carried more weight than any paycheck. And when Maria returned to her cleaning, she noticed something that hadn't been there before, the faintest suggestion that the house was listening. That evening, as October darkness settled over San Francisco like a familiar blanket, Maria sat in her own small room in the mansion's staff quarters, looking out at city lights that sparkled like scattered coins across the bay. The contrast struck her as it did every night. Down there, in the Mission, in Chinatown, in the Castro, people were living full lives in small spaces, creating warmth with laughter and music and the everyday alchemy of shared meals. Up here, in rooms that could hold entire families, people were dying of loneliness in spaces so large that grief echoed. Her mother's voice whispered from memory, as it did every night. "Mija, the heart doesn't know the difference between rich sadness and poor sadness. Pain is pain, but so is kindness." Elena Santos had cleaned houses too, had raised Maria alone after the father, who gave her his name but not his presence, disappeared into the streets of East L.A. She had understood, long before her daughter learned the lesson, that there was dignity in service, strength in humility, and sometimes the people who needed healing most were the ones who could afford everything except peace. The rain continued, washing the city in that particular San Francisco way that made everything look like a watercolor painting. Somewhere in the mansion, Maria knew, Howard Bennett was lying awake in a master bedroom that still held his wife's perfume in drawers that hadn't been opened since her funeral. Somewhere else, David was staring at law briefs that contained more commas than compassion. And Sarah was probably painting another picture that no one would ever see, creating beauty as a form of prayer in a world that had forgotten how to say amen. Tomorrow would bring the same routine. Coffee at 7:15, silence that spoke volumes, and the careful dance of people learning how to live around the space where love used to be. But tonight, in the space between rain and silence, Maria made herself a promise that had nothing to do with paychecks or job security. She would find a way to bring light into the darkness, warmth into the cold, and if she was very lucky, laughter into the spaces where it had gone to die. The fog was rolling in from the Pacific as it did every night, bringing with it the salt smell of possibility and the whispered promise that San Francisco mornings always brought something unexpected. Tomorrow the mansion would still be a mansion, the millionaire would still be wounded, and the maid would still be humble, but sometimes, in houses built of grief and guilt and gilded memories, the smallest acts of humanity could shift the foundations of everything. Maria closed her eyes and listened to the city breathe below her window, carrying in its rhythm the heartbeat of a million stories just beginning to unfold. Her story was one of them now, whether the Bennetts knew it or not. And stories, as Sarah's mother had known, were the only things that lived forever. The first real change came on a Wednesday morning when Maria discovered that David Bennett had the flu. She found him in the sitting room adjacent to his bedroom, shivering despite the expensive wool blanket draped over his shoulders, his laptop open to documents that blurred before his fevered eyes. The young lawyer, who'd normally carried himself with prosecutorial precision, looked small and vulnerable, reduced by illness to the child he had once been, before tragedy taught him that armor was more practical than openness. "Sir," Maria said quietly, not wanting to startle him, "perhaps you should rest. Your body needs—" "I'm fine," he interrupted, his voice hoarse but firm. "Just a minor cold. I have depositions to review, motions to file. The stock market doesn't stop for sniffles." But Maria had raised herself, had nursed her mother through countless illnesses with remedies born of necessity and ethnic wisdom. She recognized the particular pallor that came with fever, the way his hands trembled as he tried to type, the stubborn pride that chose productivity over healing. Without asking permission, she disappeared into the kitchen and returned with ingredients that Mrs. Henderson somehow hadn't thought to use. Fresh ginger from Chinatown, honey from the farmer's market, lemons that still held the California sun in their peels. "My grandmother's recipe," she said, setting the steaming mug on the table beside his laptop. "It won't cure everything, but it helps the body remember how to fight." David looked at the tea with suspicion, then at Maria with something closer to curiosity. "Your grandmother?" "From Guadalajara. She raised 13 children and buried 3 husbands, but never got sick a day in her life. She said the secret was feeding the body what it needed, not what it wanted." The tea was perfect. Spicy enough to clear sinuses, sweet enough to soothe throats, warm enough to penetrate the chill that had settled into David's bones. As he sipped, Maria quietly straightened the papers he had scattered, organized the files with the same care she'd brought to dusting, transformed chaos into order without making him feel helpless. "You don't have to do that," he said, but his tone had lost its usual edge. "I know," Maria replied, "but sometimes we all need someone to take care of the small things so we can focus on getting better." It was a simple interaction, lasting perhaps 20 minutes, but in those 20 minutes, something shifted in the mansion's careful balance of isolation. David finished the tea, closed his laptop, and went to bed for the first time in months without setting 3 alarms. And Maria understood that healing often began with the simplest acts. A cup of tea offered without judgment, order restored without condescension, presents given without expectation of gratitude. Word of David's recovery, faster than usual, more complete than expected, reached Howard Bennett through the mansion's invisible network of staff gossip. He began to watch Maria differently, not with suspicion exactly, but with the careful attention of a man who had learned to be wary of variables in his controlled environment. She moved through the house with the same quiet efficiency, but there was something else now, something that made dust seem less persistent, made silence seem less oppressive, made the mansion's expensive emptiness feel almost inhabited. The breakthrough came on a Thursday that dawned gray and stayed that way, as if the sky itself was holding its breath. Maria was cleaning the breakfast nook where Howard took his morning coffee, polishing surfaces that already gleamed when she heard the familiar footsteps on the marble stairs. But this morning, something was different. The rhythm was off, less certain, carrying a weight that had nothing to do with physical presence. Howard Bennett appeared at precisely 7:15, as he had every morning for 3 years. But today his hands shook slightly as he prepared his coffee, and Maria noticed what the household's careful non-interference policy had trained them all to ignore. He was struggling. The simple act of measuring sugar, stirring cream, arranging his morning ritual had become monumentally difficult, not because of any physical ailment, but because the weight of performing normalcy had finally become too heavy to bear alone. Maria continued her cleaning, but she slowed her movements, extended her presence in the kitchen without making it obvious. She was wiping down counters that didn't need wiping when Howard finally settled into his usual chair with his usual cup of coffee that would taste, she suspected, like ashes in might-have-beens. The silence stretched between them, comfortable for neither, but necessary for both. Outside, San Francisco was waking up. Cable cars climbing impossible hills, commuters clutching coffee cups that steamed with possibility, the fog beginning its slow retreat toward the Pacific. But inside the breakfast nook, time moved differently, thick with unspoken words and carefully maintained boundaries. Then, without planning to, without considering protocol or propriety or the careful rules that governed interactions between millionaires and maids, Maria spoke. "Mr. Bennett," she said softly, her voice carrying the warmth of someone who understood that some conversations couldn't wait for invitation. "Would you mind if I sat with you for a moment?" Howard's spoon stopped mid-stir. In 3 years, no member of his household staff had asked to join him for anything. The request was so unexpected, so gently revolutionary, that he found himself nodding before his defensive instincts could engage. Maria sat across from him at the small table, her own cup of coffee, instant, black, economical. creating a bridge between their worlds. She didn't rush to fill the silence with chatter or explanation. Instead, she simply sat, sharing space with someone who had forgotten that morning coffee could be a communion rather than a penance. "Why do you drink alone every morning?" she asked finally, the question emerging not as judgment, but as genuine curiosity tinged with compassion. The simplicity of it undid him. Not, "How are you feeling?" which demanded performance, or "Is there anything you need?" which required decisions, but simply, "Why?" A question that acknowledged the strangeness of solitude without trying to fix it. Howard looked at her across the table, really looked, and saw something that the mirror in his master bathroom had stopped reflecting. Human recognition. Maria's eyes held no pity, no calculated sympathy, no agenda beyond the simple desire to understand. They held, instead, the deep recognition of someone who had also learned that morning rituals could be either anchors or prisons, depending on whether they connected you to the world or protected you from it. "I'm waiting," he said finally, his voice catching on words that had been locked inside for too long. Waiting for it to hurt less, waiting for the coffee to taste like something other than guilt, waiting for... He stopped, unable to name what he was waiting for because he had forgotten what hope felt like. Maria nodded, understanding flooding her features with the kind of gentle knowing that came from intimate acquaintance with loss. "I used to wait too," she said. "After my father left, I would set the table for 3 every morning. My mother would watch but never say anything. We'd eat breakfast with his ghost for 2 years before I finally realized that waiting was just another word for dying in slow motion. The confession hung between them like a bridge neither had expected to build. Howard found himself leaning forward, drawn by the recognition of shared territory, the landscape of loss that made no distinction between bank accounts or postcodes. "How did you stop?" he asked. "I didn't," Maria said, smiling with sad honesty. "I just started waiting for different things, for my mother's medication to work, for enough money to pay rent, for small kindnesses from strangers, for morning coffee to taste like possibility instead of disappointment." She gestured toward the window where fog was lifting to reveal the bay, silver water reflecting silver sky in that particularly San Francisco way that made the whole city look like a dream someone had forgotten to wake up from. "The waiting never stops," she continued, "but maybe it doesn't have to be solitary. Maybe morning coffee tastes better when it's shared with someone who understands that some days getting out of bed is an act of courage." The conversation lasted 47 minutes, longer than Howard had spoken to another person about anything personal since Catherine's funeral. They talked about loss and routine, about the difference between solitude and isolation, about how wealth could buy every comfort except the ability to comfort oneself. Maria told him about her mother's long decline, about working 3 jobs to pay for treatments that extended life but not hope, about learning that love sometimes meant letting go. Howard told her about Catherine's final months, about how her laughter had been the soundtrack to their life together, about waking up every morning to silence so complete it felt like drowning. He spoke about his children's anger, about how grief had made them strangers to each other, about board meetings where he managed billion-dollar portfolios while feeling like he couldn't successfully manage a single day. When their conversation finally ended, both understood that something fundamental had shifted in the mansion's careful architecture of avoidance. The breakfast nook would never again be a shrine to solitary suffering. It had become, instead, a place where shared honesty made even institutional coffee taste like communion. That evening, as Maria prepared to leave for her small apartment in the Mission, she found an envelope waiting on her time card. Inside was not just her weekly salary, but an additional amount with a note written in Howard's careful script. "Thank you for reminding me that morning coffee was meant to be shared. H. Bennett." The money would help with her mother's medical bills, but the note would help with something more precious. The understanding that her work at the mansion involved more than cleaning surfaces. She was helping to clean wounds that had been festering in isolation, bringing light into spaces that had forgotten what illumination felt like. As her bus wound through the city's hills that night, Maria watched San Francisco's lights twinkle like scattered stars and understood that healing was rarely dramatic. It didn't arrive with orchestra swells or revelation fireworks. Instead, it came in small moments. A cup of tea offered to a sick young man, a conversation shared over morning coffee, the simple act of sitting with someone who had forgotten that solitude was a choice, not a life sentence. The mansion still held ghosts, the millionaire was still wounded, and she was still humble. But now they were all something else as well. They were connected. And connection, Maria had learned from her grandmother in Guadalajara, was the first ingredient in any recipe for healing. The following weeks brought subtle but significant changes to the mansion's emotional climate. The shift began with small alterations to routine. Howard's morning coffee ritual expanded to include a second-place setting. Not every day, and never by official invitation, but often enough that Maria understood her presence was no longer an intrusion, but a welcome interruption to isolation. During these shared mornings, conversations meandered through territories that neither had expected to traverse with a virtual stranger. Howard spoke about Catherine's garden, how she had insisted on planting roses that would bloom long after the fog lifted, creating pockets of color that could be seen from the breakfast nook. He mentioned his early success in tech investments, how he had built his fortune by understanding that the future belonged to companies that connected people, though he had somehow lost the ability to connect to anyone himself. Maria shared her own stories with careful honesty. She told him about her childhood in East Los Angeles, about teachers who saw potential in a girl whose dresses came from thrift stores, but whose English essays sparkled with words borrowed from library books. She spoke about her mother's fierce pride, how Elena Santos had cleaned offices in downtown L.A. for 30 years, but had never missed a parent-teacher conference, never failed to have dinner waiting, never stopped believing that her daughter's life would be larger than circumstances suggested. These conversations began to ripple outward through the mansion's carefully maintained boundaries. Sarah started joining them occasionally, drawn by the sound of voices that carried laughter instead of duty. Her presence was tentative at first, like a cat testing the safety of unfamiliar territory, but gradually she began to share her own fragments, memories of her mother's storytelling, frustrations with an art career that felt hollow despite gallery shows and trust fund security, the peculiar loneliness of having everything and feeling nothing. Even David, still recovering from his flu but returning slowly to his legal practice, began to linger in doorways during these morning gatherings. His participation came in small doses. A comment about a case he was handling, an observation about market fluctuations, questions about Maria's neighborhood that suggested genuine curiosity rather than polite obligation. The mansion itself seemed to respond to these changes. Rooms that had felt museum-like began to show signs of actual habitation. Fresh flowers appeared in vases that had held nothing but dust. Maria's doing, but paid for by a household account that Howard had quietly expanded. The sound system, silent for 3 years, except for the mechanical hum of cleaning equipment, began to carry soft music during the day. Jazz from Sarah's collection, classical pieces that had been Catherine's favorites, even some Latin rhythms that Maria hummed while working. Mrs. Henderson initially viewed these changes with a suspicion of someone whose authority depended on maintaining established hierarchies. But even she began to soften when she noticed that her carefully prepared meals were actually being eaten, that family dinners, still rare but no longer extinct, occasionally filled the dining room with conversation instead of silence. The transformation wasn't linear or dramatic. There were still days when Howard retreated into work obsessions, when Sarah disappeared into her art studio for hours that stretched into twilight, when David's legal cases provided convenient distance from family interactions. But increasingly, these individual retreats felt like temporary necessities rather than permanent exile from connection. Maria's role in the household evolved organically. She was still employed as domestic help, still maintained the professional boundaries appropriate to her position, but her presence had become integral to the mansion's emotional ecosystem. The other staff members began to seek her advice about everything, from menu planning to managing the family's varying moods. Miguel the gardener started teaching her the names of Catherine's roses, sharing the Spanish words for colors that had no English equivalents. It was during this period of gradual healing that Maria made a discovery that would later prove crucial. While organizing papers in Howard's study, a task he had specifically requested, saying he trusted her discretion with sensitive documents, she came across a folder marked Catherine's Foundation. Inside were legal documents outlining Howard's plan to establish a charitable organization focused on cancer research and family support services. The foundation had been Catherine's final wish, a way to transform their family's grief into something that might prevent other families from experiencing similar losses. But the documents were 3 years old, their legal language yellowed with age and inaction. Post-it notes in Howard's handwriting covered the margins. Call attorney, April 2021, postponed due to tax implications. Review board structure, September 2021, too overwhelming. Consider alternative approaches, February 2022, maybe next year. The pattern was clear. Good intentions paralyzed by perfectionism. Noble impulses stalled by the administrative complexity that grief made feel impossible. Catherine's final gift to the world had become another source of guilt for a man who already carried more than his share. That evening, as autumn rain turned San Francisco's eternal fog into something heavier and more insistent, Maria made a decision that went beyond her job description. She stayed after her usual hours, using the mansion's computer to research foundation structures, cancer charity best practices, even local nonprofit organizations that might serve as models for Catherine's vision. The next morning, she approached Howard with the kind of careful directness she had learned was most effective with him. "Mr. Bennett," she said as he finished his coffee, "I came across Mrs. Catherine's foundation plans while organizing your study. I hope you don't mind that I took the liberty of doing some research." Howard's face went through several expressions: surprise, defensive embarrassment, something that might have been hope, quickly suppressed by practiced disappointment. That was Catherine's idea. I've been meaning to. It's more complicated than she realized. Legal requirements, tax implications, board structures. She always thought if you wanted to help people, you just helped. But it's not that simple when you're dealing with serious money. Maria nodded, understanding both his practical concerns and the deeper issue that grief had made even acts of love feel like insurmountable obstacles. What if it was simpler? She asked. What if, instead of building something perfect from scratch, you started with something small and real? There's a clinic in my neighborhood, Dr. Ramirez's place, where families go when they can't afford the fancy hospitals. He's been trying to expand their cancer screening program, but they need funding for equipment, translation services, patient support. $25,000 could change everything for them. The number was tiny by Howard's standards, less than he spent on wine each year, fraction of what the mansion's monthly maintenance cost, but it represented something much larger, a way to honor Catherine's memory through action rather than administration, to transform grief into grace through direct service rather than bureaucratic complexity. You've thought about this, Howard said, not quite a question. I've lived it, Maria replied simply. My mother's treatments at UCSF were world-class, but the clinic in our neighborhood is where she felt human, where nurses knew her name, where doctors explained things in Spanish, where other families shared stories that made the waiting rooms feel like community instead of purgatory. Catherine's foundation could start there, grow from there, become perfect by being real instead of being delayed by the pursuit of perfection. The conversation marked another shift in their relationship, moving from personal healing toward shared purpose. Over the following days, Howard began to engage with Catherine's foundation plans for the first time since her death, but now with Maria's practical wisdom tempering his perfectionist tendencies. They researched organizations together, visited clinics in neighborhoods Howard had never seen despite living in San Francisco for decades, met with directors who spoke about serving communities rather than managing portfolios. Sarah became involved almost by accident, offering to design materials for the foundation's eventual launch. Her artistic skills, dormant since college except for paintings no one saw, found new purpose in creating brochures that made complex medical information accessible, logos that conveyed both professionalism and warmth. For the first time in years, her trust fund felt like a tool for creation rather than just a cushion against consequence. Even David contributed his legal expertise, reviewing contracts and helping navigate the regulatory requirements that had seemed so daunting when Howard tried to manage them alone. The law practice that had been his escape from family pain became his contribution to family healing. But progress, Maria had learned, was never linear. Success had a way of breeding its own challenges, and in the Bennett mansion, success in healing old wounds made everyone more sensitive to new ones. The very connections they were rebuilding made them more vulnerable to the kinds of misunderstandings that could shatter fragile trust. The crisis came in December, during San Francisco's brief winter, when the fog lifted just enough to let real sunlight stream through windows that had grown accustomed to gray. The family had been planning their first Christmas celebration since Catherine's death, not the elaborate affairs of previous years, but something simple and meaningful, centered around the foundation's first official donation to Dr. Ramirez's clinic. It should have been a moment of triumph, a celebration of how far they had all traveled from the isolated grief that had defined their household for 3 years. Instead, it became the catalyst for an explosion that nearly destroyed everything Maria had helped them build together. The trouble began with a phone call that Sarah received while decorating the Christmas tree they had decided to put up in the main living room for the first time since her mother's death. The voice on the other end belonged to Melissa Crawford, a family friend whose Christmas party invitations had gone unanswered for the past 3 years. Sarah, darling, I'm so glad the family is finally ready to socialize again. Of course, we all understand how difficult the adjustment period has been, but I must say, the rumors about your father's new involvement are quite concerning. The word involvement was delivered with a particular precision that wealthy women used when they wanted to plant poison without appearing to gossip. Sarah, still fragile from years of isolation, took the bait. What rumors? Oh, you haven't heard? About your father and the Mexican woman? People are saying she's become quite influential in household decisions, that she's been seen consulting on financial matters, that she's involved in this new charity venture. I'm sure it's all perfectly innocent, but you know how people talk, especially when there's such a disparity in backgrounds. The conversation continued for 20 minutes that felt like hours to Sarah, each insinuation building on the last, until a simple narrative of healing was transformed into something sordid and calculated. By the time she hung up, the Christmas tree looked different to her, not like a symbol of renewal, but like evidence of manipulation, decorations chosen by someone who didn't belong, changes made by a woman whose motives Sarah suddenly questioned. The poison spread quickly through the family system that Maria had worked so carefully to heal. Sarah confronted David with Melissa's concerns, and David, exhausted from a difficult case and defensive about his own growing attachment to the household's new warmth, initially dismissed the gossip, but found it lingering in his thoughts like a persistent cough. Howard became aware of the tension without understanding its source. The morning coffee conversations that had become the foundation of his healing suddenly felt stilted, forced, shadowed by unnamed anxieties. Maria, sensitive to emotional atmospheres from years of working in other people's homes, noticed the chill but couldn't identify its origin. The crisis reached its peak on December 22nd, 3 days before Christmas, when a family argument that began about party planning devolved into accusations that had been fermenting in silence for weeks. "I just think we should be careful," Sarah said, her voice tight with barely controlled anxiety. "We've become very dependent on Maria's opinions about everything. The foundation, the decorations, even family decisions. People are starting to notice." "Notice what?" Howard asked, genuinely confused by the sudden shift in atmosphere. "The situation," David said, the word heavy with implications he didn't want to name directly. "She's been here less than 6 months, Dad. Now she's consulted on foundation business. She knows our financial information. She's essentially become a family advisor. It's unusual." The word unusual hung in the air like a blade, sharp with class assumptions and racial undertones that nobody wanted to acknowledge directly. Maria, who had been arranging flowers in the adjacent room, heard enough to understand that she had somehow become a problem she hadn't realized she was creating. "Are you suggesting that Maria has been inappropriate?" Howard asked, his voice carrying the dangerous quiet that preceded his rare explosions of anger. "I'm suggesting that we need to maintain appropriate boundaries," Sarah said. "Well, she's been wonderful, but she's an employee. We shouldn't be treating her like family consultant or depending on her for emotional support. It's not fair to her, and it's not healthy for us." The argument escalated with the particular cruelty that families could inflict on each other when trust felt threatened. Years of suppressed resentment surfaced. David's anger about being shut out of family decisions during Catherine's illness, Sarah's frustration with living in her mother's memorial shadow, Howard's guilt about moving forward from grief that had defined him for so long. Maria, listening from the kitchen where she had retreated to give them privacy, understood that she had become the symbol of changes that scared them more than they comforted them. Her presence had allowed them to heal, but healing required vulnerability, and vulnerability felt dangerous to people who had been wounded deeply enough to build walls of wealth and isolation. The conversation ended with Howard making a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. "Perhaps we all need some time to think about boundaries and expectations. Maria, I think it would be best if you took a leave of absence through the holidays. We can reassess in the new year." The words were delivered with careful formality, but Maria heard the pain beneath them. Howard was sacrificing their connection to preserve his family relationships, choosing the familiar dynamics of isolation over the uncertain territory of integrated healing. It was, she understood, the decision of a man who had been hurt too many times to fully trust that good things could last. Maria packed her few personal belongings with the same quiet dignity she brought to everything else. She left no dramatic scenes, made no speeches about ingratitude or injustice. Instead, she simply gathered her modest possessions, accepted the generous severance check that Howard had written with shaking hands, and prepared to return to her small apartment in the Mission where the drama was different, but the loneliness was just as real. Her last act was to leave a note in the breakfast nook where she and Howard had shared so many morning conversations. The note was brief, written in her careful handwriting on simple stationery. "Mr. Bennett, thank you for allowing me to be part of your family's healing. Healing is never a straight line, and sometimes we need to step backward to remember why moving forward matters. The foundation will be beautiful when you're ready. Catherine would be proud. Take care of each other. Maria Santos." As her taxi pulled away from the mansion that had become more than a workplace, Maria watched the windows that had grown brighter during her months of service. The Christmas tree was still visible in the living room, decorated with ornaments that told the story of a family learning to celebrate again. But the lights looked dimmer now, filtered through the fog of misunderstanding and the protective barriers that wealth could erect against intimacy. The mansion, she realized, would survive her departure. It would return to its previous state of expensive emptiness, its residents protected by isolation from both connection and betrayal. But she had seen what was possible there, had witnessed the tentative growth of trust, the beginning stages of joy, the first moments when laughter had echoed through halls that had forgotten how to hold happiness. Those moments were real, regardless of what happened next. And sometimes, Maria thought as the taxi descended Russian Hill toward neighborhoods where Christmas lights sparkled on fire escapes and families gathered in small rooms filled with large love, planting seeds was enough. You didn't always get to see them grow into gardens. but you could trust that they would find ways to bloom when the conditions were right. The holidays passed in the Mission District with a kind of bittersweet beauty that characterized Maria's life. Small gifts exchanged with neighbors, midnight mass at Our Lady of Guadalupe, where Spanish prayers rose like incense. Her mother, Elena's gradual decline, punctuated by moments of clarity when they could laugh together about telenovelas and gossip about the building's romantic dramas. Christmas morning brought a knock on Maria's door that she wasn't expecting. Standing in the hallway, looking uncomfortable in jeans and a giant sweatshirt that suggested he had never dressed down in his life, was David Bennett. His expensive car waited awkwardly on the street below, its BMW elegance conspicuous among the Toyotas and beat-up Chevrolets that belonged to the neighborhood. "I'm sorry to bother you," he said, his legal training providing formal words for an informal situation. "Could we talk?" Maria invited him in, quietly grateful that she had cleaned the apartment that morning as she did every day, that the coffee was fresh, that Elena was having a good day, and could sit in the living room's single comfortable chair with dignity intact. The space was tiny compared to the Bennett mansion, everything visible from everywhere else. Christmas decorations, limited to a small tree decorated with ornaments made from bottle caps and construction paper, but it held warmth that money couldn't purchase. David sat at Maria's small kitchen table, accepting coffee served in a mug that had been a free gift from the local credit union, and began the conversation that had brought him across the city. "The foundation donation went through," he said without preamble. "Dr. Ramirez's clinic got the check 3 days ago. They're already scheduling mammograms that couldn't happen before. The translator position will start in February. It's exactly what Catherine would have wanted." Maria nodded, unsurprised. Howard Bennett was many things, but he wasn't a man who made promises lightly. If he had committed to supporting the clinic, the support would happen regardless of family drama. "But the house is..." David struggled with words that his professional vocabulary hadn't prepared him for. "It's wrong without you. Sarah's painting again, but they're all dark now. Dad's back to drinking coffee alone. I keep finding excuses to work late because coming home feels like walking into a tomb." He looked around Maria's small apartment, his eyes taking in details that spoke of a life lived with care despite limited resources. Books stacked neatly on shelves made from boards and bricks, photographs arranged with obvious pride, plants that flourished in windows that faced east toward sunlight that had to be carefully cultivated. "I've been thinking about what Melissa Crawford said to Sarah," he continued, "about boundaries and appropriateness and people talking. And I realized that the people who talk about inappropriate relationships are usually the ones who have never experienced appropriate ones. The people who worry about boundaries are usually the ones who have never learned how to build bridges." Elena, from her chair in the living room, had been listening with the careful attention of someone who had spent decades observing family dynamics from positions of service. "Your family is afraid of love," she said in English that carried traces of an accent, but no traces of uncertainty. "Love makes you vulnerable. Vulnerable feels dangerous when you've been hurt. But dangerous is not the same as wrong." David turned toward Elena, struck by the directness of her observation. "How do we stop being afraid?" "Practice," Elena said simply, "like playing piano or learning language. You practice caring about people until it feels natural instead of frightening. But first, you have to want to practice more than you want to hide." The conversation lasted 2 hours, meandering through topics that David had never discussed with anyone. His anger about his mother's death, his resentment about his father's wealth that couldn't prevent loss, his fear that caring about people only made their absence more painful. Maria and Elena listened with the particular attention of women who had learned that healing often began with the simple act of witnessing someone else's truth without trying to fix it. When David finally left, he carried with him more than just the understanding that his family needed Maria to return. He carried the recognition that they needed to become the kind of people who deserved her presence, people who could receive care without suspicion, who could build relationships across differences in background and bank accounts, who could choose love over safety when the two seemed incompatible. The reunion happened gradually, carefully, with the kind of attention to process that acknowledged how badly trust could be broken and how delicately it needed to be rebuilt. Howard called first, his voice formal but carrying undertones of genuine remorse. Sarah followed with a hand-delivered letter that ran 8 pages and included 3 small paintings, watercolors of moments from their morning coffee conversations that she had painted from memory. But it was Elena who orchestrated the actual return, insisting with the authority of approaching death that some conversations required face-to-face honesty. "Go back," she told Maria on New Year's Eve as fireworks exploded over the Mission District and 2024 began with promises nobody was sure they could keep. Not because they need you, but because you have more to learn there, about forgiveness, about grace, about how families can be built instead of just inherited. 2 weeks later, on a January morning when San Francisco's fog had lifted enough to reveal the bay in all its silver complexity, Maria returned to the Bennett mansion. But she returned as something more than an employee and something different from a supplicant. She returned as someone who understood her own worth, who had learned during her absence that her value wasn't determined by other people's ability to recognize it. The mansion felt different, not just because it had been cleaned by professional services that understood efficiency, but not care, but because its emotional climate had shifted during her absence. The family had learned that connection was a choice that required active maintenance, not a luxury that could be taken for granted. Howard was waiting in the breakfast nook with 2 cups of coffee prepared, but he didn't assume she would join him. Instead, he asked, with the formality of someone who had learned not to take intimacy for granted, "Would you be willing to share morning coffee with me again?" The invitation was extended not from employer to employee, but from one human being to another, carrying acknowledgement of the damage that had been done and the hope that repair was possible. Maria accepted, understanding that forgiveness wasn't about pretending hurt hadn't happened, but about choosing to build something new on the foundation of honest acknowledgement. Their first morning conversation was careful, tentative, like people learning to walk again after injury. They talked about practical things, El Niño's effect on the garden, changes in the foundation's structure during her absence, updates about her mother's condition that Howard requested with genuine concern rather than polite obligation. But gradually, over days that stretched into weeks, the conversations deepened again. They talked about class and race, about assumptions and expectations. It was about how wealth could create barriers to intimacy even when isolation felt unbearable. They discussed the difference between charity and justice, between helping people and respecting people, between changing lives and changing systems. Sarah joined these conversations more regularly now, bringing her artist's perspective to discussions about how beauty could serve justice, how creativity could bridge differences that logic couldn't span. Her paintings from this period showed new complexity, images that captured light breaking through darkness, hands reaching across divides that looked impossible to cross, faces that held both sorrow and hope in expressions that seemed entirely realistic. David's participation was different, but equally committed. His legal work increasingly focused on cases that served communities rather than corporations, and he began accompanying Maria on visits to Dr. Ramirez's clinic to understand firsthand how the foundation's money was being transformed into actual care. His questions about the neighborhood, about Maria's mother's experiences with healthcare, about systemic barriers to access, reflected genuine curiosity rather than professional obligation. The foundation work expanded organically, growing from a single clinic donation into a network of community health initiatives that honored Catherine's memory through action rather than inscription. Howard discovered that giving money away strategically required more skill and attention than accumulating it, but provided satisfaction that stock market victories never could. By spring, when Catherine's roses bloomed for the 4th time since her death, the mansion had become something it had never been before, a home that served a purpose beyond sheltering its inhabitants. The Breakfast Nook hosted planning sessions for foundation initiatives. Sarah's art studio produced materials for community health education. David's legal expertise supported advocacy work that addressed policy issues rather than just individual cases. And Maria, no longer just an employee but not quite family, something more complex and valuable than either category could contain, moved through spaces that had been transformed by her presence but were no longer dependent on it. She had taught them how to care for each other, how to find meaning in service, how to build relationships that honored difference rather than erasing it. The lesson of boundaries had been learned, but it was different from the boundaries Melissa Crawford had implied. These were boundaries that protected intimacy rather than preventing it, boundaries that honored individual dignity while enabling collective healing, boundaries that recognized the difference between professional relationships and personal ones without artificially limiting human connection. One morning in April, as fog lifted to reveal cherry blossoms that had survived another San Francisco winter, Maria and Howard sat in the breakfast nook sharing coffee that had become communion. Through the window they could see Miguel in the garden, teaching Sarah the Spanish names for colors, while David reviewed legal documents that would establish new community health programs. "I never thanked you," Howard said, not for the first time, but with new understanding of what gratitude meant. Not just for the cleaning or the care, but for teaching us that healing was possible, for showing us that family could be built as well as inherited. Maria smiled, thinking of Elena, who was resting more these days, but still insisted on hearing every detail about the mansion's transformation. "Healing is never finished," she said. "It's like tending a garden. You don't plant roses once and expect them to bloom forever without attention, but the more you practice caring for growing things, the more beautiful everything becomes." Outside, San Francisco was waking up to another day of possibility. In boardrooms and coffee shops and clinics and classrooms, people were making choices about how to treat each other, how to bridge differences, how to transform individual pain into collective healing. Some of those choices were influenced, in small but measurable ways, by foundation programs that had grown from morning conversations between a wounded millionaire and a humble woman who understood that dignity was not determined by bank account balances. The coffee tasted like promise that morning, flavored with the understanding that some transformations took years to complete, but began with single moments of choosing connection over isolation, trust over suspicion, love over fear. The mansion still gleamed with expensive beauty, but now it reflected light instead of just containing it, served purpose instead of just displaying it, sheltered growth instead of just protecting privacy. And in a small apartment in the Mission District, an elderly woman named Elena Santos smiled as she listened to her daughter's voice on the phone, describing another day in a household where kindness had learned to speak louder than money, where healing had become a shared responsibility rather than an individual burden, where morning coffee had become the foundation for building bridges that would outlast any single person's presence in the world. Time passed the way time does in San Francisco, sometimes slowly, like fog rolling over Twin Peaks, sometimes quickly, like cable cars climbing impossible hills. By winter of 2024, the Bennett mansion had settled into rhythms that would have been unrecognizable to the grief-stricken household Maria had first encountered. The foundation had expanded beyond Dr. Ramirez's clinic to support a network of community health programs throughout the Bay Area. Sarah's art had found purpose in designing materials that made complex medical information accessible across language barriers. David had transitioned his legal practice toward healthcare advocacy, discovering that justice work provided satisfaction that corporate law never could. And Howard had learned that managing charitable assets required the same strategic thinking as growing personal wealth, but provided meaning that stock portfolios couldn't match. Maria's role had evolved into something that had no official title but immense practical value. She remained based in the household, maintaining the cleaning and organizing tasks that had originally brought her there, but her responsibilities had grown to include foundation coordination, family mediation, and what Howard privately thought of as emotional architecture, the careful maintenance of relationships that allowed 4 very different people to function as a supportive unit. The arrangement would have been impossible to explain to Melissa Crawford or others in their social circle who maintained rigid distinctions between employers and employees, but it worked because it honored everyone's dignity while utilizing everyone's strengths. Maria's practical wisdom complemented Howard's strategic thinking. Her understanding of community needs balanced his understanding of financial systems. Her ability to build trust enabled his ability to build programs. But even the most successful arrangements face tests that reveal their true strength or hidden weaknesses. For the Bennett household, that test came in March when Elena Santos was hospitalized with the pneumonia that would mark the beginning of her final decline. Maria's devotion to her mother was absolute and non-negotiable, as Howard had learned during their earliest conversations. Helena had sacrificed everything to give her daughter opportunities, and Maria would sacrifice everything to ensure her mother's final months held dignity and comfort. The hospitalizations would require missed workdays, the caregiving would demand emotional energy, the eventual funeral would need financial resources that Maria's savings couldn't fully cover. The old Howard Bennett might have handled this situation with a generous severance package and understanding that personal crises required employment transitions. But the man who had learned to build relationships across difference, who had discovered that his own healing depended on caring about other people's wholeness, couldn't imagine addressing Elena's illness as simply a scheduling problem. Instead, he called a family meeting, not to discuss Maria's employment status, but to plan how they could support someone who had become integral to their lives during her time of greatest need. "Maria has given us more than we ever expected," he said to Sarah and David in the living room where Catherine's portrait still watched but now seemed to smile rather than mourn. "She deserves more support than an employee handbook would provide. She deserves the kind of help we would give to family." The conversation that followed revealed how much they had all grown during the previous year. Sarah immediately offered to take over Maria's household responsibilities, discovering that she actually enjoyed the meditation of cleaning. The tangible results of organizing spaces, the way physical care of their environment reflected emotional care of their relationships. David volunteered his legal expertise to ensure Elena received optimal healthcare navigation, while Howard quietly arranged for the family's private physicians to provide consultations that supplemented the public hospital's excellent but overburdened services. More importantly, they restructured Maria's position to provide the flexibility she needed for caregiving while maintaining the financial security she required for medical expenses. Her salary continued, her schedule adapted to hospital visits and home care demands, and her contribution to the foundation work continued through phone calls and email consultations that honored her expertise while respecting her priorities. Elena Santos died on a Tuesday in April, surrounded by family that included not just Maria, but also David and Sarah, who had learned to love the elderly woman whose wisdom had guided their own healing. Howard arranged the funeral with the same attention he brought to board meetings, understanding that final ceremonies mattered deeply to communities, that understood dignity could be expressed through flowers, music, and gatherings that celebrated lives rather than just mourning deaths. At the funeral mass at Our Lady of Guadalupe, the Bennett family occupying a pew in a church they had never entered, Howard realized that grief shared was fundamentally different from grief endured in isolation. Elena's death was heartbreaking, but it was heartbreak experienced in community, supported by relationships that made sorrow bearable and memories precious rather than painful. Maria's grief was deep but not isolating. She mourned her mother's absence while celebrating her influence, missing Elena's voice while hearing it echo in every lesson about dignity, kindness, and the quiet strength that sustained people through circumstances beyond their control. The apartment in the Mission District felt empty without Elena's presence, but it still held the warmth of conversations that had shaped not just Maria's understanding of the world, but the Bennett family's understanding of what mattered most. When Maria returned to work 2 weeks after the funeral, she found that the mansion had been transformed in small but significant ways. Photographs of Elena now sat alongside pictures of Catherine in the breakfast nook, acknowledging that both women had shaped the household's current incarnation. The Foundation's next newsletter featured an article about Elena's life, honoring her 93 years of quiet service and fierce love as inspiration for community health programs that supported aging populations. Most meaningfully, the morning coffee ritual had expanded to include a third cup, not for Elena's ghost, but for the continuation of her wisdom in conversations that now specifically included reflection on how to serve others with the dignity she had modeled throughout her life. The Foundation work continued expanding, but with renewed focus on programs that Elena would have understood and approved. Support groups for family caregivers, translation services for medical appointments, housing assistance for elderly immigrants who had spent decades contributing to communities that sometimes forgot to care for contributors who could no longer work at full capacity. By summer, as Catherine's roses bloomed more abundantly than they had since her death, the Bennett household had achieved something that wealth alone could never purchase. They had become genuinely useful to the world beyond their gates. The mansion still gleamed with expensive beauty, but it functioned as headquarters for work that made measurable differences in people's actual lives. Howard's mornings now included reviewing financial reports that tracked not just investment returns, but healthcare outcomes, community engagement statistics, and program satisfaction surveys from people whose names he increasingly knew personally. His wealth had become a tool for building justice rather than just accumulating security, though the security remained substantial, and the strategic thinking required for effective philanthropy challenged him intellectually in ways that pure profit-seeking never had. Sarah's artistic career had found new direction in work that served beauty and justice simultaneously. Her paintings were exhibited not just in galleries that catered to wealthy collectors, but in clinics and community centers, where art provided hope to people facing medical challenges. Her trust fund, previously a source of guilt about unearned advantages, became funding for art therapy programs that honored creativity as medicine for communities that couldn't afford traditional treatment options. David's legal practice had shifted entirely toward advocacy work, though his excellent education and family connections meant he could approach justice work with resources that many advocates never accessed. He represented clients who couldn't afford representation, supported policy initiatives that addressed systemic healthcare barriers, and used his knowledge of wealth structures to ensure foundation programs achieved maximum impact through strategic rather than just generous approaches. And Maria, no longer the humble maid of their initial dynamic, but not quite the wealthy philanthropist she would never become, occupied a role that honored her unique combination of practical wisdom, community connections, and understanding of how dignity could be maintained across economic differences. She was, Howard sometimes thought, the person Catherine would have become if she had lived long enough to transform grief into service, loss into purpose, private wealth into public good. On a September evening, when San Francisco's light held that particular golden quality that made the city look like a photograph of paradise, the household gathered for their weekly foundation planning meeting. These sessions had replaced the isolated dinners of previous years, creating routine that combined family time with purposeful work, personal connection with community engagement. Elena would be proud, Maria said, reviewing reports from the month's programs. 23 families receiving translation services, 15 elderly immigrants connected with housing support, 3 community health fairs planned for neighborhoods where people don't usually receive preventive care. This is what she meant when she said, healing spreads when it's shared. Howard nodded, thinking about the morning 3 years earlier when he had sat alone with coffee that tasted like despair, surrounded by wealth that felt like imprisonment. I never understood, he said, that money was only valuable if it moved, if it connected people instead of isolating them, if it built bridges instead of walls. Through the dining room windows, they could see Catherine's roses blooming in the garden where Miguel still worked. But now, with assistance from Sarah, who had discovered that growing beautiful things was another form of art, another way of creating hope from Earth and attention in time. The foundation had distributed over $2 million during its first full year of operation. But the number that mattered more was different. Hundreds of people whose lives had been changed not just by receiving support, but by being treated with dignity, respect, and recognition that their experiences mattered as much as their needs. "There's something else Elena would be proud of," David said, smiling in the way that had become natural again during the past year. "We learned how to be a family, not just people who share DNA and bank accounts, but people who take care of each other, who work together for things that matter, who remember that love is something you practice, not something you possess." As autumn settled over the city and the foundation prepared for its second year of expanded operations, the Bennett household continued its evolution toward something unprecedented in their family history: wealth that served justice, privilege that enabled rather than isolated, and relationships that honored difference while building unity around shared commitment to healing the world in whatever small ways remained possible. The mansion still gleamed with expensive beauty, but its beauty now reflected light instead of just containing it, served purpose instead of just displaying it, sheltered growth instead of just protecting privacy. And in the breakfast nook where healing had begun with shared coffee and honest questions, the morning light still tasted like possibility, flavored with the understanding that transformation was always possible for people brave enough to choose connection over isolation, service over accumulation, love over fear. Years later, when journalists wrote about the Bennett Foundation's innovative approaches to community health advocacy, they would focus on programmatic outcomes and financial strategies. But for the people who lived the transformation daily, the real story was simpler and more complex. It was the story of how grief could become grace, how wealth could become justice, how morning coffee shared across difference could become the foundation for building bridges that would outlast any single person's presence in the world. And in a small apartment in the Mission District, now empty, but still holding the warmth of conversations that had shaped both a daughter's wisdom and a millionaire's healing, Elena Santos' spirit rested in the understanding that love, carefully tended and freely shared, was always the most valuable inheritance anyone could leave behind. On a December morning that dawned clear enough for the bay to sparkle like scattered diamonds, Maria Santos stood in the breakfast nook of the Bennett mansion, preparing coffee with the same careful attention she had brought to the task for 3 years. But everything else had changed in ways that made the familiar ritual feel like daily proof that transformation was not only possible, but sustainable. The table now held 3 cups every morning, one for Howard, one for herself, and one that rotated between Sarah and David depending on their schedules, because family breakfast had become a daily celebration of connection rather than an obligation to endure. The conversations that filled these mornings meandered through foundation business, family updates, and the kind of philosophical discussions that Elena Santos had insisted were essential nutrition for souls as well as minds. "The clinic network will serve over 1,000 families this year," Howard said, reviewing reports that documented not just financial expenditures, but actual outcomes. Children who received early intervention services, elderly immigrants who accessed healthcare in languages they understood, families who learned to navigate systems that had previously seemed impossibly complex. "And the art therapy programs reached 6 schools, Sarah added, her voice carrying pride that had replaced the hollow emptiness of her previous life. "Teachers say students are more engaged. Parents report better communication at home, and I've learned that creativity really is medicine when it's shared with intention." David's contribution was characteristically practical, but increasingly passionate. "The policy advocacy work is showing results too. 3 new laws supporting healthcare interpretation services, expanded funding for community clinics, and regulatory changes that make foundation giving more effective for grassroots organizations." Maria listened with satisfaction that had nothing to do with taking credit and everything to do with witnessing growth. The people around this table had learned not just to heal individually, but to create healing for others, to transform personal pain into community service, to use privilege as a tool for justice rather than a barrier to connection. The Bennett mansion had become something unprecedented in its century of existence, a home that served a purpose beyond sheltering its inhabitants. Every room now held evidence of work that mattered. Sarah's studio produced materials for health education campaigns. David's office coordinated legal support for community organizations. Howard's study managed philanthropic strategies that honored Elena's wisdom about dignity. And Maria's quarters had become informal headquarters for coordinating direct services that connected foundation resources with neighborhood needs. But the transformation wasn't just institutional, it was fundamentally personal. The people who shared morning coffee had learned to love each other, not despite their differences, but because of them, understanding that healing happened when different kinds of strength combined to address different kinds of need. "There's something I want to discuss," Howard said, setting down his cup with the deliberate gesture that meant serious conversation was beginning. I've been thinking about legacy planning, not just financial legacy, but the kind of legacy that ensures this work continues regardless of what happens to any individual person. The conversation that followed revealed how thoroughly their understanding of family, wealth, and responsibility had evolved. Howard's estate planning now included provisions that protected the Foundation's mission while ensuring Maria's financial security, Sarah's artistic career, and David's advocacy work could continue independently if needed. But more importantly, it included structures that embedded their shared values into organizational systems that could outlast personal relationships. I want to endow a permanent position, Howard continued, that ensures someone with Maria's combination of community connections and practical wisdom always has authority in Foundation decision-making, not as an employee or consultant, but as a partner whose perspective is essential to everything we do. The offer was generous, but also strategic, recognizing that sustainable change required institutional structures that honored the human relationships which made transformation possible. Maria's acceptance came not from financial need. The years at the Bennett household had provided enough savings to ensure her mother's medical care and her own security, but from understanding that Elena's lessons about shared healing were most powerful when they were embedded in systems that could reach beyond individual lives. As winter settled over San Francisco, bringing fog that made the city look like a dream someone had forgotten to wake up from, the household continued its evolution towards something that would have been impossible to imagine during Maria's first morning in the mansion 5 years earlier. They had become not just a family, but a team, not just wealthy individuals, but community builders, not just people who survived grief, but people who transformed it into grace. The Foundation's annual report, published that December, included a photograph that captured their achievement better than financial statistics could. Howard, Sarah, David, and Maria standing together in Catherine's rose garden, surrounded by blooms that thrived because of careful attention, holding documents that represented hopes transformed into policies, smiling with the satisfaction of people who had learned that wealth was only valuable when it moved, when it connected rather than isolated, when it served justice rather than just accumulating security. The picture would later hang in Dr. Ramirez's clinic, inspiring other families to understand that healing was possible across differences in background, bank account, and language. It would grace the walls of community centers where Foundation programs provided services that honored dignity while addressing need. It would remind thousands of people that transformation was always possible for anyone brave enough to choose connection over isolation, service over accumulation, love over fear. But for the people in the photograph, the image simply documented another morning in lives that had been rebuilt around the understanding that some transformations began with coffee, shared across difference, and sustained themselves through daily choices to care about each other's wholeness. The mansion still gleamed with expensive beauty, but its beauty now reflected light instead of just containing it, served purpose instead of just displaying it, sheltered growth instead of just protecting privacy. And in the breakfast nook, where healing had begun with shared coffee and honest questions, the morning light still tasted like possibility, flavored with Elena Santos's wisdom that healing spreads when it's shared, that dignity is not determined by bank account balances, and that love, carefully tended and freely offered, remains the most valuable inheritance anyone can leave behind. Years would pass, bringing changes that tested and strengthened their commitment to serving communities beyond their gates. Sarah's art would be exhibited internationally, but her most meaningful work would always be the pieces that provided hope to families facing medical challenges. David's legal career would include arguments before the Supreme Court, but his most important victories would be policies that ensured healthcare access for immigrant communities. Howard's investment strategies would continue generating substantial returns, but his greatest satisfaction would come from witnessing programs that transform financial resources into dignified care for people who had been invisible to previous generations of wealth. And Maria, no longer the humble maid of their initial dynamic, never quite the wealthy philanthropist she would never become, would continue occupying the role Elena had prepared her for. The person whose understanding of dignity, service, and quiet strength enabled others to discover their own capacity for building bridges across differences that seemed impossible to span. The coffee would continue tasting like communion, flavored with understanding that morning rituals could be either anchors or prisons, depending on whether they connected people to possibility or protected them from change. Their choice, to begin each day by sharing warmth, planning service, and remembering that healing was work that required daily attention, ensured that the mansion remained not just a home, but a headquarters for hope, not just a shelter, but a sanctuary where different kinds of strength combined to create different kinds of healing. And you? Have you ever worked for someone who learned from you without ever saying it? Tell me your story in the comments. If this story touched your soul, leave a like and subscribe so it reaches another woman who needs hope today. For more emotional stories like this, Click the podcast link on the left. Thank you for joining us on this journey of the heart. We'll see you in our next story.